Mike Hall's massive car auction in 2021 seemed like the final chapter of his story. In a single day, for decades of collecting disappeared, as if everything he had built vanished before his eyes. The final episode of Rust Valley Restorers captured that heartbreaking moment, showing fans the devastating sale. Viewers thought it was the end, saying goodbye to the junkyard king they had followed for years. But then, something unexpected happened. New episodes began airing. Mike was still in front of the cameras, still restoring cars, and somehow still living his dream. How could a man who sold off his empire continue keeping his show alive? The answer revealed a hidden truth that most fans never realized about what was really happening behind the scenes. Mike Hall was born on February 4, 1958, in St. Boniface, a neighborhood of Winnipeg, Manitoba. When he was still a young boy, his father accepted a job with the Canadian Pacific Railway, forcing the family to move west to Kamloops, British Columbia. That move would shape his entire life. Growing up in the open interior of British Columbia gave Mike endless freedom to explore dirt roads, fields, and forgotten corners of the countryside. And soon, one obsession completely consumed his world: cars. Not shiny showroom vehicles, but rusted, decaying wrecks that sat abandoned in fields and behind barns. By the early 1970s, as a teenager, Mike was already sneaking into backyards and wandering rural roads in search of dead cars that he could bring back to life. While other kids were spending their money on records, bikes, or the latest trends, Mike was dragging home old junkers nobody else wanted. Where others saw useless rust, he saw hidden potential. A battered coupe from the 1950s or a rotting pickup wasn't trash in his eyes, it was a challenge waiting to be conquered. Some of his friends laughed at him. Neighbors thought it was strange. But Mike didn't care. He kept collecting, storing car after car anywhere he could. While most kids were still wondering what they wanted to do with their lives, Mike had already found his purpose: fixing anything with wheels. By the time the late 1970s arrived and Mike was in his 20s, his collection had grown to dozens of vintage vehicles. He had never gone to trade school, and no certificates decorated his walls. His education came from real-world experience. He taught himself how to rebuild engines, weld metal, and resurrect vehicles most people would have left for dead. Every broken-down car he brought home was a lesson. Every engine that refused to start became an opportunity to learn. Over time, those lessons transformed into genuine skill, the kind that couldn't be taught in a classroom, but was earned through bloody knuckles, sleepless nights, and freezing winters spent inside makeshift sheds. Mike Hall never expected to own hundreds of cars, but his obsession with rust and engines didn't come out of thin air. In the 1980s, before television fame, he was already living on the edge in a dangerous line of work. He launched a company called Chimera Springs Rockworks, and this was far from an ordinary construction job. Mike wasn't pouring foundations or laying bricks. He was drilling into cliff faces, hanging from ropes, and setting off controlled explosions. It was grueling, hazardous work that most people would never dare to attempt, but Mike thrived on the adrenaline. His wild dreadlocks and explosive career earned him a nickname that would stick with him forever: the Rasta Blasta. For decades, through the 1980s, 1990s, and into the 2000s, Mike kept blasting rocks and cliffs across British Columbia, building a reputation in his trade and earning good money. But while he worked hard, he wasn't saving much. Nearly every dollar he made went into buying old cars. He didn't care if they were rust-eaten shells, missing parts, or long forgotten. If Mike believed a vehicle had a soul or a story worth preserving, he wanted it. The worse its condition, the more he was drawn to it. He wasn't chasing pristine classics. He was collecting rust buckets that had been left to rot. Slowly, his property filled with machines of every kind: rare muscle cars, battered pickup trucks, European sports cars that hadn't run in years. Every blasting job funded another rescue. By the time the 2010s rolled around, people started asking just how many cars Mike owned. The number shocked everyone. More than 400 vehicles covered his land, turning it into a sea of rust and steel stretching as far as the eye could see. He used to joke that he wasn't collecting cars, he was collecting rust. That's how the name Rust Brothers was born. His crew wasn't just a group of mechanics or employees. They were fellow believers in his strange mission. Mike wasn't trying to flip cars for profit or create a pristine showroom. He wanted to save machines that the world had abandoned. Even if they never got fully restored, just rescuing them from the scrapyard felt like a victory. Outsiders might not have understood it, but to Mike, every car had meaning. He once admitted that he simply couldn't walk away from a vehicle that needed saving. It was in his blood. Despite his growing reputation as a car hoarder, Mike Hall never set out to be a public figure. Long before cameras ever arrived, he was living quietly in the Shuswap region of British Columbia. He had married, though he kept his wife's name private, and together they raised a family that included their son, Connor Charman Hall, born in the 1980s. A small dog named Minnie also became part of the household. But even with family responsibilities, Mike's obsession with cars never faded, and it began causing tension at home. His wife eventually laid down a strict rule: no more junk cars on their farm. The property was already 26 acres, and she didn't want it turning into another graveyard of rust. Mike didn't argue. Instead, he found another solution. He purchased a separate 5-acre lot in the nearby town of Tappan, just off the Trans-Canada Highway near Shuswap Lake. That land would become legendary. The new property turned into what Mike called his field of dreams, a vast stretch of sun-baked ground filled with hundreds of rusting vehicles, some dating back to the 1940s, others from the 1970s, many buried in weeds or stripped down to their frames. But to Mike, they all had life left in them. He wasn't seeing piles of junk. He was seeing untapped history. Throughout the 2000s, Mike's life played out between two extremes. By day, he was blasting rocks for highway projects, dangling from cliffs and setting explosives. By night, he turned into a lone mechanic, tinkering in his junkyard like a mad scientist, determined to breathe life back into forgotten metal. He wasn't doing it for recognition, he did it because he loved it. Then, fate intervened in 2016. While working in the mountains of British Columbia, a massive rockslide blocked a highway, and the cleanup crew called in Mike Hall for help. When he arrived with his blasting equipment and expertise, he caught the attention of a television crew filming a documentary called Highway Through Hell. They filmed him in action, climbing cliffs, setting charges, and clearing the slide with his trademark Rasta Blasta style. It was just a brief cameo, but it changed everything. His wild dreadlocks, fearless attitude, and larger-than-life personality made viewers stop and take notice. By then, Mike was in his late 50s, and his Tappan property had grown into something extraordinary. More than 500 rusted cars sprawled across his land. Some had sunk into the earth, others were covered in tall weeds, but Mike knew every single one. He could name the make, model, and year of all 562 vehicles just by looking at them, and he remembered where each one came from. Some had been with him for decades, even 40 years. They weren't just cars, they were his life story. But the weight of his obsession was beginning to show. Maintaining such a collection wasn't only about space anymore. It required money, time, and energy, and it was attracting attention, sometimes the wrong kind. Neighbors were curious. Authorities began asking questions. By 2020, Mike admitted that age was catching up to him. He knew he would never live long enough to restore every car he owned. His father had died at just 60, and Mike was now approaching the same age. The thought haunted him. He had seen friends and collectors pass away suddenly, leaving their families to deal with overwhelming messes. He couldn't stop thinking, what will my wife and kids do with 400 cars in a field if I'm gone? It wasn't just a passing thought. It was a warning, and it pushed him to make decisions that would change everything. In 2016, after decades of collecting and chasing rust, Mike decided he had to slow down. He had more than 300 cars spread across his 5-acre property, and it was simply too much. So he made a radical choice: sell it all. The land, the cars, the chaos, everything, he listed it for $1.19 million. Most people thought he was crazy. Who would want hundreds of junkers on a field? When no serious offers came in, Mike shocked everyone again. In 2017, he raised the price to $1.45 million. That's when the story went viral. A man selling 5 acres and 300 plus cars? News outlets across Canada picked it up. Pictures of his rust-covered land spread online, and Mike went from a local eccentric to a national curiosity. Suddenly, car enthusiasts across the country began calling, offering to buy individual vehicles. But an even bigger surprise came when television producers started reaching out. Tyson Hepburn, a producer who had worked on Highway Through Hell, remembered Mike and his incredible property. With the internet buzzing, Hepburn pitched the idea of a TV series. Mike was hesitant at first. He didn't want to be exploited or turned into a joke. He made it clear he wouldn't do it unless the show was meaningful. His dream wasn't about chaos, it was about restoring classics and finally making something beautiful out of the madness. At 60 years old, instead of fading quietly into retirement, Mike Hall opened the gates of his rusty kingdom to the world. With Mayhem Entertainment and Chorus Studios backing him, he agreed to film a show that would transform his obsession into something greater. He built a proper workshop right on his land in Tappan, surrounded by mountains of decaying cars, and called it Rust Brothers Restorations. The premise was simple but powerful: take the forgotten cars he loved, restore them, and try to sell them. But anyone who knew Mike understood it was about much more than money. It was a fight against rust, against time, and even against his own emotional attachment to the very cars he was trying to let go of. Filming began in 2018, and Mike brought in his closest allies. His longtime friend Avery Schoaf, a heavy equipment mechanic nicknamed the Muscle Car MacGyver, joined as his right-hand man. His son Connor became the voice of reason, handling the financial messes Mike often left behind. Body technician Cassidy McEwen and parts manager Sarah Ward rounded out the team. Together, this unlikely crew united under one mission: to save cars the world had abandoned. The show wasn't flashy. It didn't rely on big-budget effects or staged drama. It was raw and real, showing small-town people chasing a dream with heart and humor. On December 6, 2018, Rust Valley Restorers premiered on the History Channel in Canada. Almost instantly, audiences fell in love with Mike's eccentric personality, big heart, and relentless optimism. He wasn't a polished businessman, he was the junkyard dreamer who refused to give up on rust.